Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of the Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, in the first topic, we'll try to trace the legacy of the great tribal freedom fighter Birsa Munda on his birth anniversary today, as highlighted in the editorial by none other than the President of India herself. Then in the second topic, we'll try to understand what is Armed Forces Special Powers Act 1958 and what are the issues which revolves around it. Then from your simplified section, we'll be taking up 5 news. We will not only try to simplify the news for you, but also provide the much important value addition and practice questions keeping in mind the approaching prelims 2025. So stay tuned. The editorial written by the Honorable President of India today in the Indian Express highlights the role of Birsa Munda in the Indian freedom struggle and the steps taken by Government of India for the tribal warfare. The iconic struggle which was launched by Birsa Munda against the Firangis or the British colonial power forms an important component of your GS1 paper under the theme of important events and personalities in the Indian freedom struggle. So let's first try to understand about the Birsa Munda, the heroic son of the motherland. The Birsa Munda, who is also worshipped as Dharti Aba or Bhagwan in the modern day state of Jharkhand. And he was born on 15th of November, the today very same date, in the year of 1874. Where at Ulihatu, which was in the erstwhile colonial state of Bengal and in the modern state of Jharkhand. As the president highlights herself, even though Birsa Munda lived only for the short span of 25 years, he ended up becoming the hero of people's resistance against the colonial exploitation, where he actually arose the tribal mindset, made them aware about their lost traditions, and raised the banner of revolt against the Firangis or the British colonial power. This rebellion or the Ulgulan, which was launched by Birsa Munda, was specifically in which region? In the region of Chota Nagpur. Specifically comprising of the Munda belt which basically comprised of KTSB, that is the region of Khunti, Tamar, Sarvada and the Bandgaon region. Now during his school life in the initial years, he was actually converted to the Christianity. But he was very young and very soon to realize this mission civilisatris or this missionary zeal among these Christian schools to actually convert this uneducated, poor tribal people into the fold of Christianity. Thus, very early in his life, he reverted back to the original tribal religious systems under the influence of a Vaishnava preacher whose name was Anand Panrai. Now, what were the issues beside this Christian zeal of Lutheran, Anglican, Catholic missions which were taking place to convert these tribal people? Beside this, what were the other issues which were actually being faced by these tribal people? So these tribal people, they actually used to claim ancestral ownership on this forest land because they were inhabiting these areas from generations. And on the basis of this claim, they actually used to enjoy a kind of a preferential rate as Khund Kattidar. Preferential rate of what? The revenue which they had to pay the local zamidars of the region. And what does we mean by Khund Kattidar? It basically means the original clearer of the land. However, after the signing of Treaty of Allahabad 1765, we see the rise of Britishers as a political power in our country, where they start introducing their revenue policies in the region, revenue policies such as, for example, permanent settlement system which was introduced in this Chota Nagpur region. Permanent settlement system was introduced under which Governor General? Under the Cornwallis, who was Governor General from 1786 to 93. This permanent settlement system actually required the zamidars to pay a kind of a certain amount of revenue to the British government, specifically around 11th portion of the produce which was actually being taken place. The 1/11 share actually used to go to the zamidars. The total share of the percentage was around 46% to 50% of the produce. Now the zamidars had to pay this to the government. Now under the pressure of the sunset clause under this permanent settlement system, the zamidars were actually forced to collect this revenue or expand the area of cultivation. Otherwise, they will end up losing their zamidari right, which was actually transferable. So what these zamindars will do, they will expand the area of cultivation, and that will eventually start infiltrating this ancestral area of tribals as well, leading to the introduction of dikus or foreigners. Who were these foreigners? The zamindars, the thekedars, the zagirdars, or sahukars or moneylenders. Now remember that this mobilization of non-tribal people into the tribal area was actually a kind of a planned mobilization by the Britishers. The reason being that they wanted to create a civilized area with uniform source of revenue. Why? Because these tribals, they used to follow a kind of a system called as jhum cultivation or podu cultivation, which basically means the shifting type of cultivation, where they basically used to cultivate a significant portion of the land, and then after reaping the harvest they used to burn that land so that the land generates its kind of production capability naturally over the course of years, and then they used to migrate to another area to cultivate. Now according to the Britishers, this was actually the loss of cultivable land for them, as well as now the uniform source of revenue collection cannot take place because of this shifting cultivation. Beside this, there was also other growing economic hunger among the Britishers, such as, for example, after the introduction of railways in 1853, the Britishers required the timber or wood to lay down the sleeper of the railways. Or for example, they wanted the oil which could be extracted from sal and mahua plants. Or for example, the flowers of kusum and palash flowers can actually be used to extract natural colors for the dyeing of clothes and leather. So all these economic requirements of the colonial empire eventually led to the British government passing the Forest Act 7 of 1882, which basically said that any such fallow or wasteland which lies in these Munda villages, that was actually declared as protected areas by the government under the Forest Act, and thus shifting cultivation was actually banned in this area. Also under the very same act, the British government actually launched a kind of a forest settlement operations, where they started defining the ownership, land ownership of these tribal people in the area. So obviously the tribal people will be enraged because that is directly violating their ancestral ownership, the hereditary ownership which they used to claim on these forest land. And that actually reflected in the kind of Sardar agitation which started taking place in this Munda belt from the year of 1858 onwards itself, which was actually termed as a kind of a Mulk ki Ladai, where various tribes like Munda and Oraon tribes actually raised the banner of revolt, specifically in the leadership of Gideon of Parang, in the Parhat area specifically. What were the issues against which they were fighting? They were fighting against the loss of ancestral rights as Sardar, the abolishment of Bait Begari system or a kind of a forced labor system which was introduced by these Britishers, or to abolish the zamindari in that particular region. But remember that this Sardar agitation being led by Mundas before the arrival of Birsa Munda, it was actually of more Gandhian characteristic, or of the moderate characteristic, where they used to term themselves as a British subject, and their method of resistance was what? 3 P's of moderates: the prayer, the petition, or the protest. So it was basically in non-violent character. Now, from the year of 1890 to 94, it is actually considered as one of the most formative years of Birsa Munda, where he also was at one point of time part of this Sardar agitation in the year of 1890. Then by the year of 1895, he actually started claiming that he had a divine intervention, and that eventually led to a kind of a socio-revivalist movement. Now this movement, which was launched by Birsa Munda, is actually characterized into 2 different strands by Sumit Guha in a book which he has written called as Tribe and State in Asia. The one character of this movement of Birsa Munda was of kind of a socio-religious reform movement, where he actually started claiming the tribals to just inherit their ancestors' practices and the kind of worshipping practices which they were doing. And he started criticizing the churches as well, right? So the idea was to do what? To revert back to the original tribal form of worshipping, to give up the animal sacrifice, to stop taking the intoxicants, to wear a sacred thread, and to retain the tribal worshipping of Sarna or the sacred groves in the region. But at the same time, there were also certain militant characteristics, such as, for example, he kind of raised a war against the church, where he became highly critical of church practices of conversion, as well as the kind of taxes which they were levying on these tribal people. Then he created a kind of a faith of his followers called as Birsa and asked them to non-payment of taxes. And if we refer to the British sources says that at one point of time he also asked his followers to kill the Thekadars, Jagidars, Rajas and Hakims in this Chota Nagpur region, thus waging a war directly against the British government. The call or the war cry of Birsa Munda was Abua Raj Ete Jana, Maharani Raj Tundu Jana, or basically let the kingdom of the queen to be fall and our kingdom to be established. He defeated the Britishers in a very specific battle called as Battle of Tanga River in 1897. However, he was later arrested and imprisoned for 2 years. And then if we refer to the Bipin Chandra states that he came out from that jail as a kind of a firebrand, where he eventually assembled approximately 7,000 of his followers, the Birsaites, on the Christmas day of 1899, 25th December 1899, and asked them to wage a war, that is the Great Tumult or Ulgulan, against the British symbol of powers. So his followers basically started attacking the churches, burning them down, such as for example in the region of Ranchi, Singhbhum, etc. Then on 7th of January 1900, the infamous case of the Khunti police station took place, where they burned down the police station and several constables there, thus ultimately forcing the commissioner of the region A. Forbes to pass an order to actually terminate the Birsa Munda, and for that purpose a reward of rupees 500 was actually put on him to give information about Birsa Munda, leading to his arrest on 3rd of February 1900 in the Janka Poi forest region. And ultimately he succumbed to death in the month of June 1900 in mysterious conditions, right? So the idea is that this revolt actually acted as a kind of a great resistance, ultimately forcing the British government to pass a Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act of 1908, under which the passing of non-tribal land the tribal land to the non-tribal people was completely prohibited. At the same time, this Bait Begari system was also abolished under this Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act of 1908. The president recognizes this effort of Birsa Munda and says that how the government has recognized the effort of these tribal freedom fighters and has on November 21 has declared it to be a kind of a Janjatiya Gaurav Divas, where we celebrate and kind of try to make the larger citizens of our country aware about the contribution of the tribal freedom fighters. Also, the 2nd October 2024, the government launched a Dharti Aba Janjati Gram Utkarsh Abhiyan, under which we are actually trying to provide various kind of social infrastructure in 63,000 tribal villages. Then the government has also launched PM Janman to actually provide 11 basic amenities, such as for example Pakka Ghar, tap water, the road connectivity to the region, the electricity, the hostels for the education purposes, the skilling of these tribals. All that has been launched under the PM Janman, which is basically a joint initiative of 9 ministries. Then the president writes in the today's editorial that how in Rashtrapati Bhavan she actually arranged a kind of a Janjatiya Darpan, where a kind of a gallery, huge exhibition was actually raised by the president to make people aware about the rich art and cultural heritage of these tribal people. Also, the government launched a Viksit Bharat Sankalp Yatra, where we are actually trying to make these tribal people aware about the various welfare activities which the government is taking, such as for example the Pradhan Mantri Kusum Yojana or Ujjwala Yojana, Gobar Dhan Yojana, all that which can also be utilized by these tribal people. Then the government is specifically trying to raise the living standards of this particularly vulnerable tribal group mission, specifically under the Article 46 of the Constitution, which directs the state to raise the education and the economic status of the scheduled tribes. The question which shall be coming in your mind is that who are these particularly vulnerable tribal groups? Well, it is defined by the Ministry of Home Affairs as the most vulnerable section among these scheduled tribes, and the recognition of which, the criteria for recognition, was actually laid down by Debar Commission, which was established in 1960 during the 4th 5-year plan, where it recommended certain criteria on the basis of which these PVTGs are recognized. What are the criteria? The criteria are to have like these tribal people who are practicing the pre-agriculture technology, the slash and burn agriculture. They have literally low level of literacy. The economic backwardness or their population has either become stagnant or it is declining. So on the basis of that, the government in the year of 1975 declared 52 tribes. Currently we have how many scheduled tribes? 705. 52 of them in 1975 was declared as PVTG, and then in the year of 1993, 23 more tribes were added in this PVTG list, thus making it total 75 PVTGs. These 75 PVTGs, which actually lies in 18 states and 1 union territory, that is the territory of Andaman and Nicobar. Which state has the highest particularly vulnerable tribal group? That is Odisha with 30, followed by Andhra Pradesh 12. Bihar and Jharkhand both has 9 each. The name of some prominent tribes from these states has been written here. Just have a quick look at them. And on the basis of this discussion, just try to solve this one prelims question which appeared in 2019 and this prelims question in 2020. Towards the end, you guys can also attempt this mains answer, and we move forward to the next news. As the Armed Forces Special Power Acts of 1958 has actually been reimposed in the state of Manipur, the news piece throws an important question to ponder upon the efficacy of this controversial act of AFSPA. The AFSPA, which forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the larger theme of government policies and interventions. We will start from tracing the history of this AFSPA. And obviously it has colonial traces, because on 15th of August 1942, the British government actually promulgated an Armed Forces Special Power Ordinance. Remember, that is just 7 days after the launch of Quit India movement, which was launched on 8th of August by the Gwalior Tank Declaration. Can any one of you name that in the absence of the senior leadership of Indian National Congress, which was the woman who actually furled or hoisted the national flag at Gwalior Tank on 9th of August 1942? A very interesting question. Now the idea is that this act was actually issued to just kind of curtail the Quit India movement which was taking place at that time. Under the very same act, the kind of restrictions which was being put on freedom of speech and expression and movement was also passed on to the state of Assam in 1947 to curtail the internal security challenges which was arising from the partition horrors. Then in 1950s, we start seeing the rise of separatist movement in Nagaland, where the Naga Nationalist Council was actually created in 1946, which declared itself on 14th of August 1947 as an independent state, leading to the creation of a kind of an underground separatist movement in the form of Naga federal government in 1952. In 1975, we see the formation of National Socialist Council of Nagaland, which actually rejected the Shillong Accord which was being offered by the government at that time. This NSCN actually splits into the Isak Movaya IM and the Khaplang factions, and this NSCN IM was actually banned in the year of 1990. Which ultimately signed the ceasefire pact with the center, and in 2015 signed an accord with the current government. So this is the history of kind of the separatist movement which was taking place in the Nagaland, and obviously that forced the government what? These internal security challenges, these rising secessionist tendencies, insurgency in Northeast, that led the government to pass the Armed Forces Special Powers Act of 1958. What was the idea? The idea was to actually empower or provide unbridled power to the armed forces and central armed police forces in the disturbed area. Here keep this in mind, one keyword, that is disturbed area. Now what are these unbridled power which was actually provided to these special forces or the forces which are deployed in these regions? These unbridled powers constitutes that they can now fire upon or use of force even causing death. That can take place in the contravention of any law for the time which has been imposed in the disturbed area. These forces can lead to the destruction of any fortified position or shelter for armed attacks, and they can also arrest without warrant even if some reasonable suspicion exists, which is obviously quite vague and undefined. The next is that they can just enter and search premises without any warrant. Remember, one of the most important provision is to actually provide a kind of a prevention to these armed forces from any kind of prosecution or legal suit, which can only take place if the central government has provided a nod to actually take this armed police force or policemen into some kind of action, right? So obviously there is a kind of a lack of accountability. Remember this as well. Now the question arises that what is this disturbed area where these armed forces are actually getting this unbridled power? So the act again just keep it vaguely defined by stating that such disturbed area means an area which for the time being has been declared by notification in the official gazette under section 3 of the act. Largely, we can assume that such disturbed area actually constitutes of disputed areas, the disputes which can have arisen between two communities, and that can be on the basis of, let's say, religion, racial, ethnicity, linguistic, etc. Now, who has the power to declare such disturbed area in these under this AFSPA Act in these states? So, first of all, the governor of state can do that. Then the administrator of union territory can do that. The central government or Ministry of Home Affairs can do that. Keep this in mind here that under the Disturbed Areas Act of 1976, if any such area is actually brought into the disturbed area category, so let's say for example, if in Manipur 6 areas has been brought under the disturbed area category, then these 6 areas are going to be there for at least 3 months time period. So let's say if the area was declared on 14th of November, it will stay till 14th of February, such an iconic date for such an act. The idea is that after that, the state government can actually recommend the central government that whether the area shall remain in disturbed area category or not. This is basically a kind of a recommendation in the nature, and it's complete prerogative of the central government to keep the area as disturbed area or not. Now, in which particular states this is currently under imposed? So that is in your Nagaland, it is your in Manipur, as we can see, it is your Arunachal Pradesh and Assam. So these 4 states are currently imposed, and for Jammu and Kashmir we have a separate act for that, but the same powers which are provided to these armed forces under AFSPA, the same powers can also be imposed in Jammu and Kashmir as well, but the act is different. Just remember this. There were other states as well which has been removed from it now, like such as for example Mizoram, Tripura, Meghalaya, etc. So currently there are 4 states. Now the idea is that despite such controversies which you guys might be reading in the newspaper, this AFSPA Act has certain kind of credibility. So if we look at the sharp decline in this terror related incidents after 2014, it actually gives the voice to the demand of AFSPA. Such as for example, just look at Jammu and Kashmir. Right? So how the cases has actually been declined after the imposition of AFSPA. Or for example, in Northeast, just see the sharp decline which we can see from the year of 2014 till the year of 2021 as it was presented in the Lok Sabha, this particular data. So yes, it has credibility, but at the same time there are certain issues which revolve around this Armed Forces Special Power Acts. Let's try to have a look at them as well. The first is that obviously it leads to the violation of states' autonomy, because as we saw that under the section 3 of the act, only central government has the sole authority to declare any particular area as a disturbed area. However, under the schedule 7 of the constitutions, where the division of the power has been done between the central and the state government, the authority to maintain public order in the particular state lies with the state government. So it can basically create a kind of a federalism issue as well. Second is obviously the excessive and the disproportionate use of force which has been provided, as we saw, to fire upon or the use of force without which can even cause the death, to arrest without warrant, to search a premise without a warrant. So all that has kind of like far-reaching impact. The third is, one among this far-reaching impact is obviously the violation of civil liberties of the innocent citizen, curbing down their freedom of speech and expression, their movement, their right to dignified life under Article 19 and 21 respectively. Also, there exists a kind of a lack of accountability on behalf of these armed forces, such as, for example, various human rights groups have time and again raised the issue of human rights violations which are being committed, or the atrocities which are being committed by these armed forces, which is can be also evident from the iconic Iram Sharmila's 16 years hunger strike, which she took against this kind of authorities or the atrocities which are being committed by these armed forces, under where she actually witnessed one of that in the Manipur, where she actually witnessed these police forces actually killing 10 people while they were waiting at the bus station. So obviously there are certain issues of human rights violations by these armed forces, and thus the idea is that the way forward can be to actually include the Supreme Court's directive in formulating or bringing certain amendments to this AFSPA. What are the Supreme Court's directive? So, in Inderjeet Barua versus the State of Assam 1983, the Supreme Court held down that the governor's power to actually declare disturbed area cannot be arbitrary and shall be based upon some legislative guidelines. However, remember that still the section 3 remains undefined. So the disturbed area can be declared, and what is this disturbed area? It has been not defined anywhere. So obviously that gives far-reaching power to the government. Second is that in the People Movement of Human Rights versus Union of India 1998, the Supreme Court held that there shall be periodic review of this disturbed area. So currently it has to be reviewed after 3 months, but the idea is to bring it further down in 1 month or something. Next is that in H. Gowai versus Union of India 1988, the armed forces must act in cooperation with district administration and they shall not act as an independent body. So there shall be a kind of a collaboration which shall exist between the district administration and the police forces. And in the Rishang Keshing 1983 case, the Supreme Court held that any person who is being arrested shall be handed over to the officer in charge in the nearest police station with the least possible delay. However, even that has remained undefined. So these are the issues which revolves around AFSPA. These are the directives of Supreme Court which shall be incorporated. Remember that Law Commission in one of its report actually recommended to repeal the AFSPA. Obviously that demand was rejected considering the internal security challenges. On the basis of this, try to answer this particular question. We move forward to the next news, where we are actually going to analyze the issue of hate speech and what the Supreme Court has held very recently on this particular heinous issue, which forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the theme of government policies and interventions, and GS1 paper under the theme of social issues. So obviously it is not difficult to understand the concept of hate speech. For example, imagine yourself as a UPSC aspirant with repeated attempt and you are attending a family function. And there comes an aunt, a distant aunt of yours, whose sole purpose of life is to actually humiliate you and term you as a failure. And when she is doing that in the public in front of your relative, she is basically committing an act of hate speech. Why? Because she is kind of derogating your self-respect. She is kind of reducing your social standing. However, the exam of UPSC does not know about the existence of this auntie of yours. So does there exist a kind of an official definition for hate speech? Loosely so. Well, Supreme Court in Pravasi Bhalai Sangathan versus Union of India 2014 held that such hate speech is a speech which basically entices enmity between the groups based on prejudice against caste, religion, race, sexuality, etc. But also keep in mind that under the Indian Penal Code of 1860, there was no such definition which existed, and even under the recently promulgated Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita 2023, it does not define hate speech at all. These acts of hate speeches which might be coming in your newspaper, you might be reading about it very frequently. One of the very infamous incidents being, for example, the kind of Dharm Sabha which took place in Haridwar in December 2021, where a kind of a genocide against a particular committee was openly called for. Right? Remember that the much hated Hitler died back in the year of 1945. Or for example, there was actually a TV show which actually made kind of comments about a particular community's people getting into the very same UPSC examination you guys are preparing for. At that time, the Information and Broadcasting Ministry actually found it offensive, but yet did not stop the channel from telecasting the further episodes. So these are the kind of the issues of hate speeches and why they are existing, because it is not defined anywhere. right? The idea is that what can be the significant impact of these hate speeches. First is obviously that it acts as a threat to the integrity of the country. For example, you guys can recall about the partition horrors which took place, the partition of our country in the year of 1947 on the communal lines. And a major reason for that is because of the charged atmosphere which was created by the speeches of the politicians of that time. You guys can recall about the Direct Action Day, which was called by Muhammad Ali Jinnah on 16th of August 1946, which led to the spread of communal violence across the country, ultimately facilitating the partition. Obviously, it has such hate speeches, it can polarize the society, polarize the mind of innocent, uneducated, unemployed youth specifically, leading to what? Leading to various kinds of riots and genocides, and that will obviously have a spillover effect on the public order and harmony. Then, such hate speeches forms an important component of providing a foundation to the socially sanctioned atrocities such as, for example, the mob lynching in our country. Another serious issue. And all of this obviously violates the right to dignified life of an individual under Article 21, where the individual shall not face any kind of discrimination by state or by people on the basis of race, religion, caste, sexuality, etc. Just look at the number of communal riots which took place in our country in the month of February itself. 7 in Bihar, 10 is the grand total, 1 Gujarat, Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand each. The idea is that there exist any kind of legal safeguards. So here we are going to do a kind of a comparison between the Indian Penal Code of 1860, what that provided for hate speeches, and the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita of 2023. So under Indian Penal Code 1860, there were certain provisions. So obviously there is no specific law which has been created by the government. It has not defined it anywhere. The Indian Penal Code 1860 had certain indirect provisions, as for example section 153A, which actually prohibited spreading of any kind of enmity between different groups on different grounds of race, religion, caste, etc. Section 153B, which actually prohibited any kind of assertion which is prejudicial to national integration. Section 295A, which kind of prohibited any kind of deliberate attempt to outrage religious feelings. Section 125 of RPA 1951 states basically that any kind of candidate, if he is indulging in any kind of hate speech, it can lead to the imprisonment of 3 years. SC/ST Prevention Act of 1985 provided for imprisonment of 6 months to 5 years if you are trying to spread enmity between any kind of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes community. The Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita also has certain indirect provisions, as for example section 196, which basically is the reflection of section 153A, and the spread of such enmity over the electronic communication, like over your social media, that has also been included. On the similar line, section 197 is basically the reflection of section 153B, kind of assertions which can act prejudicial to the national integration, and here also the social media platform has been included. The only innovative change which has taken place in Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita 2023 is that it has actually got provisions to curb down the mob lynching of a person. The mob lynching of a person, which has actually been defined as a murder of an individual by 5 or more than 5 members on the basis of prejudice which acted against this person on the basis of race, religion, caste, color of this particular person. For that, Section 103 Clause 2 defines mob lynching, and it provides for capital punishment against the mob lynching to curb down this issue. What is the recent verdict of Supreme Court? Supreme Court has held that hate speech cannot be calculated on the very same pedestal as making a false claim or wrong assertion. So if a politician, let's say, has made any kind of false claim about a community, that cannot be considered as a hate speech. And thus it dismissed a petition which was filed by Hindu Sena Samiti, which was seeking the framing of guideline to prevent hate speech by political leaders. That shall be done for sure. Also, there was a kind of an instance where rhetoric had allegedly threatened public order against a specific Kisan leader. So what are the steps which shall be taken? First of all, the recommendation of 267th Law Commission shall be followed, where it said that this hate speech shall be included as a kind of a valid restrictions on Article 19 Clause 1, that is freedom of speech and expression. So just because you have freedom of speech and expression, you cannot use it to actually spread enmity between the people, to actually reduce the national harmony. The idea is that there already exists certain restrictions on freedom of speech and expression. Can any one of you name them down in the comment box? The second is the recommendation of Bej Barua committee, which actually recommended for the criminalization of hate speech. Then to ensure legal responsibility of the speeches by politicians by creating a specific act or amendment in the RPA 1951. Or we need to actually make people much more aware about their fundamental duty. So these days people are much more aware about their fundamental rights. We need to make them aware about their fundamental duties to actually incorporate fraternity and brotherhood as under Article 51A. And only then the idea which the government is envisaging of Ek Bharat and Shresth Bharat can actually be incorporated. So remember these suggestions, remember the important acts which we have discussed, remember 267th Law Commission, and we move forward to the next news, where we are going to read about a very important international initiative, that is Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which forms an important component of your GS3 paper under the theme of environment conservation and GS2 paper under the theme of bilateral groupings and agreements. Let's start by understanding what is Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So let's first imagine yourself as a European Union manufacturer whose name is Vasco da Gama, arriving in India on 17th of May 1498. The idea is that you need steel to create ships so that they can actually traverse across the Cape of Good Hope and reach to India. But the steel production is eventually going to generate a lot of carbon dioxide. And this carbon dioxide is actually going to violate the European Union's climate policy, such as one being the Fit for 55 pledge which the European Union countries has adopted. What is this Fit for 55 pledge? So they are basically saying that they are going to reduce their carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emission by 55% by 2030 from the level of 1990. To do what? To actually achieve the target of Paris Agreement, which was adopted in COP21 2015, which actually kinds of put a legal obligation on the countries to reduce down the world or the global temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. Below 2 degrees Celsius of what? From the pre-industrial level. So to achieve this Paris Agreement target, these European Union countries adopted this Fit for 55 pledge. But now when you are producing the steel to create the ships, it is going to violate that. At the same time, there exists another provision, and that is emission trading scheme. So you say that, okay, I'm going to produce this steel in Europe, but by producing it, I'm generating a lot of carbon dioxide. So what I can do, I can actually buy some carbon certificates from the countries which are reducing or which are producing low amount of carbon dioxide as per the standard, the global standard which has been allotted to them. But that will obviously increase the cost of your product, right? Because you are paying extra for the carbon which you have generated to buy the carbon certificate. So what you do, you actually move this carbon intensive production of steel to India. India, let's assume, as a country which has less stringent climate policy, and thus there the cost of steel production is cheaper. You not need to pay any more this emission trading scheme and all for the production of steel, and you import back this carbon dioxide intense steel back to Europe. This is a phenomena which is called as leakage of carbon. And to prevent this, the European Union said that now when you are importing this carbon intensive product from a country which has less stringent climate policy, then you will need to buy a carbon certificate from European Union, which will be implemented from the year of 2026. Now the idea is that this carbon certificate either can be paid by the importer, that is Vasco da Gama, or it can be paid by the non-European Union producer, that is Vajiram of Calicut. Now Vajiram of Calicut has, let's say, surplus of steel. He wants to sell, but the European manufacturer Vasco da Gama is like that, no, I cannot buy from you because I will have to pay a lot of money for that to buy this carbon certificate under this CBAM. So the Vajiram of Calicut offers that you need not to do that because I will end up paying for this carbon certificate so that you buy the steel from me. Thus, obviously, it will impact the market competitiveness of this Vajiram of Calicut. Now, what are the products which has been included in this CBAM? That is cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizer, electricity, hydrogen, etc. Now, what does today's article states? It states that EU rolled out this carbon border adjustment mechanism, which taxes what? Certain products coming from where other countries on the basis of emission footprint. The idea is that let's say for example, if the imported steel was produced by a process that entailed higher emission than the emission standard for the product in Europe, then it will be taxed. Thus, it eventually leads to what? It allows the industries in the Europe to remain competitive while continuing to maintain high environmental standards as well, because carbon dioxide emission is not taking place in Europe anymore. And it prevents these industries from relocating their production to the countries like, let's say for example, India, where it might be cheaper owing to the less strict emission norms. Now, the article highlights that these kind of policies being adopted by these developed nations is ultimately leading to various kind of trade protectionism. For example, UK and Canada are also discussing their own version of this carbon border adjustment mechanism. Or for example, European Union has already banned the imports of products made from illegally harvested forest. Then if we talk about the Inflation Reduction Act of United States of America, which is basically to clean energy technology or electric vehicle industries, it actually amounts to climate related non-tariff measures that can actually impact the global trade as well. The article highlights that these countries are actually trying to bring these kind of protectionist steps because of two reasons. First is that for various such products, let's say for example steel, these European Union countries are heavily reliant on China for import. Thus, they are trying to decouple their global supply chain from China, which is a kind of a strategy called as China Plus One strategy. Second is that because after the impact of pandemic, it has led to what? It has induced a kind of a fear among these countries. They have developed a trust over the global supply chain, right, which can be disrupted in any such unforeseen event, and that can significantly impact the economy of these countries. That's why they are kind of adopting this trade protectionism. The idea is that such CBAM can actually have a lot of impact on India's interest as well. Why? Because if we look at the kind of data which has been provided to us by Observer Research Foundation, it tells us that European Union is currently India's third largest trading partner. And if this CBAM will be applied on the steel product being exported to European Union, that will lead to the additional cost of $3 to $4 per ton of steel exported. Thus, the steel industry can actually leads to 3% of reduction in their export earning. Also, various such products which we are producing, they are not being generated from renewable energy. Rather, we have a huge reliance on coal-fired electricity. So that can have a significant impact as well. Our products, by the time they reach to Europe, they will become highly expensive. So our market competitiveness will decline. Then we also have a lack of emission trading scheme where we can actually trade the kind of, let's say if we are producing any product with less amount of CO2, we can do this certificate trading that is not present in our country, and this shows the inability to showcase low carbon products in European Union. The article says that there are certain kind of preventive measures which do exist, such as for example, the Paris Agreement has a provision to seek to protect developing countries from social and economic impact of response measures which shall be taken to fight the climate change. Also, in your Dubai climate meeting, it was decided that measures which are being taken to combat the climate change, including the unilateral ones by the countries, they should not constitute any kind of unjustifiable discrimination against or which can ultimately lead to kind of restriction on international trade. CBAM also overlooks the differentiation which is embedded in the global climate architecture, which allows them to be treated differently than the developed nations. That is something is the argument of developing countries, right? Also, industries in developed economies with emission standards which are comparable to EU, they will stand in the benefit. Correct? Because let's say for example, if US has the same kind of emission schemes like EU, so obviously its products will not be charged. So now the European Union will be importing more from US rather than in comparison to India. So obviously that would lead to more competition in European market. The idea is that against this provision, the basic group countries which include your India, Brazil, South Africa and China, they made a kind of a request to discuss during this COP29 on the lines of this CBAM. However, remember that this request was completely rejected. So remember this CBAM, remember the issues which we have highlighted. Let's see what the future actually holds for us. What are the kind of the reforms which Indian government will bring, and we move forward to the next news, where we are going to talk about a very interesting article about the discovery of insulin. The insulin which we use to tackle with the issue of diabetes, which forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the larger theme of health sector. Let's first try to understand a little bit about the human physiology. Remember, this particular paragraph has very important statements related to your upcoming prelims examination. The idea is that the endocrine glands act by releasing chemical messengers which are called hormones. And these hormones, they travel throughout the bloodstream to actually influence distant organs and tissues, thus guiding our basic body functions. So for example, if I'm moving my hand right now, the idea is to transmit the brain's instruction to peripheral organs and the tissues. That is the responsibility of nervous and endocrine systems. Now, unlike the nervous system, which operates through a network of neurons, this endocrine system executes the brain order across the body without an anatomical network. In this endocrine system, pancreas holds a very unique position, the reason being that it is both, write it down, endocrine and exocrine organ. And this pancreas plays a very important role in managing the blood sugar level through release of insulin, right? Let's first try to understand what does we mean by diabetes. So diabetes is a condition where the level of sugar in your blood is too high, right? The idea is that our body needs sugar for energy, and from where we get this energy, let's say for example, whatever the food and the drinks which we are having, the kind of breaking up of glucose and sucrose and fructose. To do this, our body makes a chemical, and that is called as insulin. This is made in pancreas. This insulin actually allows the sugar in our blood to enter the cells and then fuel our body. However, in diabetic conditions, the pancreas doesn't sense when the sugar has entered into the blood, or it can also mean that it is not producing enough insulin by the pancreas. So what happens? The sugar stays in the blood instead of entering into the cells, and so the blood sugar level rises to the higher than normal. Now, there are two kinds of diabetes. First is type 1 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, the body is not making enough insulin itself. The pancreas are not producing enough insulin. In type 2 diabetes, the body is not responding to the insulin which is being produced by the pancreas. Now, this type 1 can be caused by various kind of immune system reactions, such as for example, there can be environmental factors as well, viral infections and all. Here in type 2, it is much more impacted by the lifestyle factors, and genetics also contribute. This type 1 diabetes, it often starts in childhood, while type 2 diabetes is more common in the middle age. The idea is that this type 1 diabetes mellitus is an autoimmune disease where the immune system attacks the insulin beta cells in the pancreas, leading to the high blood sugar resulting from insulin deficiency. Now, unlike this type 2, which we have understood, which is most common in adults, the first type often affects children and young adults. Globally, around 9 million people have this type 1 diabetes, while this incident rate in India is around 4.9% per 1 lakh annually, per the information given by PIB in 2022. So, to tackle with this issue of diabetes, what we need insulin. And what led to the discovery of insulin? So the idea was that the First World War veteran Frederick Banting had this idea of identifying the pancreatic secretion which is responsible for carbohydrate metabolism. And for this purpose, he actually kind of collaborated with Charles Best, leading to the successful isolation of insulin from the islets of Langerhans or dogs. Then there came James Cole, who actually made the practical application of insulin therapy possible by creating a method for purifying insulin, removing toxic impurities, and ensuring its safety and efficacy, as the insulin was prepared now mostly from ducks and cows. Remember that in 1923, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was rewarded to Frederick Banting and John MacLeod for discovering this insulin. And how does this insulin works? So just look at this first case here. Here what is happening, this is your insulin, this is your insulin receptor, this is your basically the blood cell. Here is your glucose channel. Now the idea is that this glucose channel is basically closed. Then the insulin goes and unlocks this glucose channel, where the glucose channel gets open, and thus the glucose enter from the blood to the cells of the body. Correct? Idea is, here is a very interesting question. The Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine of 2024 has been given for which particular discovery? Just comment that down. And we move forward to the next news, where we are going to look at a very interesting news which has featured today, and that is about that now the industries will not require dual eco clearance which they required earlier, forming an important component of the GS3 paper under the theme of environment conservation. What does the article says? The article says that the government has actually said, the Ministry of Environment, that it has heard to the long-standing demand by the industries by exempting 39 categories of industries from the mandatory requirement of approaching state pollution control boards for the permission to run their industries. And this has been specifically given to the white category of industries, meaning they are least polluting in the nature by a 2016 classification of CPCB, that is Central Pollution Control Board. For your prelims purpose, just note down what constitute this white category of industries. So for example, it includes the manufacturing units of solar cells and modules, the wind and hydel power units, the fly ash bricks, the leather cutting and stitching. You guys can get confused in this option. Remember, assembling, repairing and servicing of AC forms the white category, not the manufacturing of AC. Remember this. The idea is that now these kind of industries, the white category industries, will not require the compliance of environment clearance and consent to establish for setting up new industries. So now these non-polluting white category industries will not be required to take a CT, that is consent to establish, or consent to operate at all. These industries will have taken EC, will not be required to take CT. So the idea is you get the environment clearance. Now after getting that clearance, you do not require this consent to establish at all, right? Before this, what were the earlier clearances which were required to set up an industry? First was obviously the Environment Impact Assessment, which was introduced under the Environment Protection Act of 1986. Then you need to have a kind of a no objection certificate from state pollution control boards. Then you need to have a no objection certificate that you are not a polluting industry under the Water Act of 1974 and the Air Act of 1981. You also required a kind of a permission from municipal corporation or panchayats if you were setting up a industry in kind of a outside the industrial area, in a very near to the habitation area. Now remember that if you are taking EC, you do not require the CT, that is basically the consent to establish. Also remember that the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1974, it was basically the first piece of legislation in our country to identify the need to have an institutional structure to address the contamination of water bodies. And from this Water Act of 1974 led to the creation of what? Statutory organizations, which were basically Central Pollution Control Board and State Pollution Control Board, which were basically charged with monitoring and preventing public water resources from getting contaminated by sewage and industrial effluents. Now remember that some of the amendments which has been done to this Water Pollution Act by the government, under which now this new provisions has been provided by the ministry, it has actually give the central government more authority to override SPCB in some instances. For example, earlier the SPCB permission was actually required to establish any industry or treatment plant which could discharge sewage into a water body, sewer or land, but now this power has been given to whom? To the central government. So remember these important provisions, and we move forward to the last news of the day, where we are going to talk about a very important rocket system, and that is Pinaka, which forms an important component of your prelims under the important defense systems on which factual statements can appear. The idea is this Pinaka, this rocket system, the name actually derives from the bow of the Lord Shiv. And it was basically a kind of a replacement of Russia's Grad BM-21 rocket system. This Pinaka rocket system, which you guys can see here, mounted on a Tata truck, is actually designed by the Armament Research and Development Establishment, that is ARDE, and the DRDO. And it is what? It is basically a free flight artillery rocket area bombardment system where it can have multiple warheads, such as for example blast cum pre-fragment explosives, which can eventually neutralize a whole area. Earlier, the range used to be around 38 km, but as per the today's article, it has actually been enhanced to 75 km now. With this, we can actually target multiple warheads, multiple neutralization of a particular war area can be done. Remember that such efficacy can be utilized to counter terrorism, enhance our border defense and conventional warfare as well. So remember these important bullet points which we have created for Pinaka rocket system, and with this we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation guys, and thank you.